It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. Okay, we got a really good guest today. We heard about him through Patrick Knowlton. We just did a show with Patrick Knowlton about his experience with Brett Kavanaugh during the whole Vince Foster investigation. He's written a book called The Martyrdom of Thomas Merton, an Investigation. He's co-authored with David Martin, I think, who has also been on the show as well. You can find his website at the martyrdom of thomasmerton.com. Also, too, he's part of this other website that we were plugging with Patrick Knowlton, FBI-coverup.com. He's a journalist, and he's also a magician, too, so maybe we can get him to do some tricks for us. Maybe they'll cut me in half during the interview here. Mr. Hurley, are you there?
I'm here. This is Hugh Turley, and I'm happy to be on your program.
Thank you so much. Mr. Turley, tell us about yourself. Who is Hugh Turley?
Well, I am a professional magician. I made a living as a magician here in the Washington area. People often ask me, what do I do for a living? I say I'm in the deception business. And they say, oh, you work for the D.C. government. I say, no, I'm a magician. I'm different than the politicians downtown because I tell you that I'm going to fool you before I do it. But I've been in the deception business since I was in college, philosophy in college. So I pursued that major because I was interested in the truth. And I've always been interested in the truth of things. But at the same time, I've gotten into deception as a hobby, and then it became a profession. But my magic skills have actually helped me find the truth, because to get to the truth, oftentimes you have to get past what's false and how people have fooled us into believing things that are false. So it's that those two things kind of go well together, deception and seeking the truth.
How about hypnotism? A lot of magicians are hypnotists as well.
No, I haven't gotten into that, but that's that one. The hypnotism requires that you almost you go a little too close to deception, because you have to pretend that you're really doing it. And I do comedy, so I let people know that I'm up to mischief.
Okay, excellent. So now you've written this book, The Martyrdom of Thomas Merton, an Investigation. Tell us, who was Thomas Merton?
Thomas Merton was a writer, and he was a Trappist monk. He was a very famous writer in the 20th century. He published about 70 books, I guess, during and after his lifetime, and then probably as many books have been written about him. And he was a convert to the Catholic faith and then became a monk. He was very serious about his Catholic faith. And he was a contemplative person and a very interesting man. And he was, like myself, he was a man who loved the truth. And I think I remember when I read his biography, it was a very famous book called The Seven-Story Mountain. And this book was published in 1948, right after World War II. And it brought a lot of young men and women into the religious life. People really loved that book. It was a very big selling book, and it talked about his conversion. So it's been compared to the Confessions by Augustine. And Augustine was a man who lived in the 5th century, and he was a lawyer in Rome, and then he used to go to the games where they had the gladiators, and he lived a pretty decadent life, and then he converted to Catholicism and became a bishop of Carthage. And Merton's book, The Seven-Story Mountain, was compared to Augustine's biography. And I've read both. They are similar if you read them both. They're very interesting men and interesting stories. And then Merton died suddenly in 1968. It was the same year that Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King died. I was 19 years old that year, a college student, and not paying too much attention to Merton or politics. I think I was maybe like Brett Kavanaugh. I was interested in beer.
Right.
That's what I was doing in college, doing a lot of this work. But I had not paid too much attention, where he died on December 10th. It's 50 years ago this year. So this year is the 50th anniversary of his death. And as this year was approaching, my co-author, David Martin, who I met when I was researching the Vince Foster death, and we were working with Patrick Knowlton, his attorney, he had been kind of urging me to look into Merton's death because he knew I was a good investigator and a good researcher, and he wanted me to look into this. He said, you really need to look into Merton's death. Let's see if we can do something and find out what really happened. And at his urging, I started to do my research. And then when it came to writing the book, Martin is probably a much better writer than I am. I'm kind of good at the research end. He wanted me to get it all down on paper, and then he helped me polish it up. And I put him in as my co-author because he really did major contribution. I don't think I could have done this book without him. It was really a collaborative effort of the two of us. So
he passed on in 1968. Was he an activist as well, just like all the people?
Well, he was known as that. Yes, he was known as an anti-war activist, but not like the Berrigan brothers. Daniel Berrigan and his brother, they were more confrontational. And it was during the Vietnam War, there was a lot of activism against the war, and some people were more adversarial. But Merton, being a contemplative, was kind of behind the scenes. He didn't get a lot written about war. He wrote a book called Peace in the Post-Christian Era, but his community, the Trappist monks, would not let him publish it. The Master Superior General of the order said that they wouldn't let him publish that book, although it was completed. He had a publisher, and it was all set to go. But he had taken a vow of obedience, so that book was not published. It was eventually published in 2004. It's a fabulous book, Peace in the Post-Christian Era. And you can substitute the word communism with the word terrorism, and the book is totally relevant to today and to nuclear weapons and so on. He was very much opposed to nuclear weapons and thought we were at the brink, which we were in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But he was actually more dangerous as an opponent of the people that were promoting the war than the average person knows, because Merton not only opposed the violence of the Vietnam War and war in general, he had zeroed in on the role of the news media and the press in shaping public opinion. And he knew that most of the news was not true. And what's remarkable about this man is, get this, he's living in a cloistered monastery called the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky. And he doesn't have a newspaper, and he doesn't have a television. So he isn't really a big consumer of the news, but he wrote a lot of letters. I think he wrote about 10,000 letters. And he got letters from people. People wrote letters to him. He wrote letters. And people would come to meet him and see him. And he really knew a lot about what was going on in the world. But he knew it better than most people because he didn't watch the news, which is full of a lot of misinformation. He wrote in one of his books, 90% of the news we receive every day is false. And some days he said 100%. That's a pretty remarkable statement. And I'm amazed when I read things by Merton like that, because I wonder, how did he know that? How did he figure that out? Because I eventually came to my own conclusion that much of the information that we receive in the universities and in the newspapers and in the magazines and the movies and the television and so on, most of it isn't true. But, the people are not really aware when they get information, and it's hard to know what's true from what's false. This man had his finger on that, and he was, I think, maybe a week or two after the Kennedy assassination, he kept a journal, and he had already written in his journal that he thought the whole idea of Oswald killing Kennedy was absurd. I mean, he said that then Ruby kills Oswald. I mean, he didn't buy that for a minute. And people that lived through that era, we were told by Walter Cronkite that that's the way it was, and people believed it. And a lot of people still do, but they still teach that story in the universities and high schools and grade schools. And it's on the anniversary of the Kennedy assassination of JFK, they still repeat it as if they did the day it happened. But Merton didn't believe it from the beginning, and that's pretty unusual. I think that I can't think of any other people that were so doubting at the time, but he was.
Yeah, but like you said, if you can filter out that white noise, all that white noise out there that's going on, you can kind of focus in and just use your own logic. You just kind of see what makes sense and what doesn't make sense.
Yeah. That's what he did. And see, then, by not only did he oppose the Vietnam War, he was critical of the news media. Now, he didn't have a big crowd down on the mall like Martin Luther King did. He drew about 250,000 people there to hear him speak. And he didn't have a platform like Bobby Kennedy when he was running for president. But he was behind the scenes writing to influential people. I mean, he wrote letters to Lyndon Johnson. He wrote letters to Apple Kennedy. He wrote letters to all kinds of writers and politicians and leaders around the world. And he was having an impact. So he was a genuine threat to the powers that be, not so much because people will say to me, well, they wouldn't kill him because he was an anti-war protester. They didn't kill other anti-war protesters. Well, that wasn't what I think got him killed. What got him killed was his keen awareness that the news media was the big promoter of war. And they were the ones that set the wheels in motion, that promoted the propaganda. And he was onto that. And that made him a genuine threat.
And we know today just how heavily infiltrated the news media is, we have people come on the show and they do the research, and even TV shows like Cupcake Wars, American Idol, and you find out that they have all kind of funding from CIA and the military. Just fascinating. They have their hand in every single little thing we watch on TV. Even if it's you think it's harmless.
Yeah, well, they have every layer covered. So even from the simplest shows to the late night comedians on their late night shows joke about what's in the news because they keep feeding it to everybody and repeating it. Repetition is important when they soak this stuff into people's brains. Right now, Patrick Knowlton's attorney, John Clark, called it saturation. And people get pounded with this information over and over till they believe it. And if you hear one voice of truth speak up, it really has no effect because it's just one little whisper and all this cacophony of things that are coming out that are leading in the wrong direction. But Merton was smart that way, and I think it made him that's what I think got him killed, really.
Now, I thought I saw somewhere, too, in this description of the book, the martyrdom of Thomas Merton, an investigation. It mentioned, too, that he kind of introduced the Western world to the Dalai Lama and all that. What is that? I can't find it now.
Well, I don't want to say he introduced him to the Dalai Lama. He was a contemplative monk, and he had an interest in all mankind, really. And he wasn't just opposed to the Vietnam War. He was opposed to just war, and nuclear war in particular. But he went, his final trips, he lived in the monastery, I think about 27 years he was in there. And he never really came out except to go to a doctor's appointment or something. But he got an invitation to attend a conference in Asia, in Thailand. So when he made this trip, he went to Alaska, and then he went on to Asia. And he traveled and met the Dalai Lama. And he was scheduled to go to Japan after he left Thailand. But he traveled in several Asian countries. And he had an interest in Buddhism, and because it was a meditative type of experience, like his contemplative life as a monk, and he was curious about other forms of meditation. I think he recognized that there's truth, some truth at least, in all religions, and there's things you can take from other religions that are the truth about things. So he traveled there and was meeting with various people for that purpose. But now there's been stories, of course, after someone's dead, they really can't defend themselves or speak for themselves. But some of Merton's critics would say, well, he was going to go join the Buddhists. He was going to leave his Catholic faith. He was going to leave the monastery, and he was no good because he was, so they criticize him that. That's really not legitimate. He was not going to leave his monastery. He was going to go back to the monastery. He just traveled to Asia and met with some Buddhists along the way, but that wasn't where he's going to leave one faith for another religion. That's not the case. Although it's popular myth.
Now, you mentioned before there's a Thomas Merton Institute or a foundation or something like that. Why don't we give them a plug for people who want to learn more?